Welcome. This is Abyss Whispers. Today's video is going to be a little bit different from my previous ones, but don't worry if you liked my Elden Ring roleplay videos. I have another one coming really soon, so keep an eye out for that. Besides, I'm hoping you'll enjoy this one too if you like soft-spoken reading. Going through the catacombs in Elden Ring really reminded me of one of my favorite books, A Monk by Mathew Lewis. It was published in, I think, 1796, so it's in the public domain if you are interested in finding a PDF online. The gameplay footage that you're seeing here is from Wyndham Catacombs, or Wyndham Catacombs, Wyndham, I don't know. Yeah, I died a lot in these catacombs, but eventually I make it through, so. The passage I'm going to be reading from the monk is a section where one of the characters is describing how she was imprisoned in the catacombs under her convent where she's a nun. And basically she was imprisoned because she got pregnant, which you can't do when you're a nun, of course. If death or dead babies might disturb you, then please don't listen. Otherwise, here it is. Enjoy. Conclusion of the history of Agnes de Medina. My supposed death was attended with the greatest agonies. Those moments which I believed my last were embittered by the Domina's assurances that I could not escape perdition. And as my eyes closed, I heard her rage exhale itself in curses on my offense. The horror of this situation, of a deathbed from which hope was banished, of a sleep from which I was only to wake to find myself prey of flames and furies, was more dreadful than I can describe. When animation revived in me, my soul was still impressed with these terrible ideas. I looked round with fear, expecting to behold the ministers of divine vengeance. For the first hour, my senses were so bewildered, and my brain so dizzy, that I strove in vain to arrange the strange images which floated in wild confusion before me. If I endeavored to raise myself from the ground, the wandering of my head deceived me. Everything around me seemed to rock, and I sank once more upon the earth. My weak and dazed eyes were unable to bear a nearer approach to a gleam of light which I saw trembling above me. I was compelled to close them again and remain motionless in the same posture. A full hour elapsed before I was sufficiently myself to examine the surrounding objects. When I did examine them, what terror filled my bosom! I found myself extended upon a sort of wicker couch. It had 6 handles to it, which doubtless had served the nuns to convey me to my grave. I was covered with a linen cloth. Several faded flowers were strewn over me. On one side lay a small wooden crucifix, on the other a rosary of large beads. 4 low, narrow walls confined me. The top was also covered, and in it was practiced a small grated door. Through this was admitted the little air which circulated in this miserable place. A faint glimmering of light that streamed through the bars permitted me to distinguish the surrounding horrors. I was oppressed by a noisome, suffocating smell, and perceiving that the grated door was unfastened, I thought that I might possibly effect my escape. As I raised myself with this design, my hand rested upon something soft. I grasped it and advanced towards the light. Almighty God, what was my disgust, my consternation, in spite of its putridity and the worms which preyed upon it, I perceived a corrupted human head, and recognized the features of a nun who had died some months before. I threw it from me and sank almost lifeless upon my bier. When my strength returned, this circumstance and the consciousness of being surrounded by the loathsome and moldering bodies of my companions increased my desire to escape from my fearful prison. I again moved towards the light. The grated door was within my reach. I lifted it without difficulty. Probably it had been left unclosed to facilitate my quitting the dungeon. Aiding myself by the irregularity of the walls, some of whose stones projected beyond the rest, I contrived to ascend them and drag myself out of my prison. I now found myself in a vault, tolerably spacious. Several tombs, similar in appearance to that once I had just escaped, were ranged along the sides in order, and seemed to be considerably sunk within the earth. A sepulchral lamp was suspended from the roof by an iron chain, and shed a gloomy light through the dungeon. Emblems of death were seen on every side. Skulls, shoulder blades, thigh bones, and other leavings of mortality were scattered upon the dewy ground. Each tomb was ornamented with a large crucifix, and in one corner stood a wooden statue of St. Clare. To these objects I at first paid no attention. The door, the only outlet from the vault, had attracted my eyes. I hastened towards it, having wrapped my winding sheet closely around me. I pushed against the door, and to my inexpressible terror, found that it was fastened on the outside. I guessed immediately that the prioress, mistaking the nature of the liquor which she had compelled me to drink, instead of poison, had administered a strong opiate. From this, I concluded that, being to all appearance dead, I had received the rites of burial, and that, deprived of the power of making my existence known, it would be my fate to expire of hunger. This idea penetrated me with horror, not merely for my own sake, but that of the innocent creature who still lived within my bosom. I again endeavored to open the door, but it resisted all my efforts. I stretched my voice to the extent of its compass and shrieked for aid. I was remote from the hearing of everyone. No friendly voice replied to mine. A profound and melancholy silence pervaded through the vault, and I despaired of liberty. My long abstinence from food now began to torment me. The tortures which hunger inflicted on me were the most painful and insupportable, yet they seemed to increase with every hour which passed over my head. Sometimes I threw myself upon the ground and rolled upon it, wild and desperate. Sometimes, starting up, I returned to the door, again strove to force it open, and repeated my fruitless cries for succor. Often, I was on the point of striking my temple against the sharp corner of some monument, dashing out my brains, and thus terminating my woes at once. But still, the remembrance of my baby vanquished my resolution. I trembled at a deed which equally endangered my child's existence and my own. Then would I vent my anguish in loud exclamations and passionate complaints. And then again, my strength failing me, silent and helpless, I would sit me down upon the base of St. Clair's statue, fold my arms, and abandon myself to sullen despair. Thus passed several wretched hours. Death advanced towards me with rapid strides, and I expected that every succeeding moment would be that of my dissolution. Suddenly, a neighboring tomb caught my eye. A basket stood upon it, which till then I had not observed. I started from my seat. I made towards it swiftly as my exhausted frame would permit. How eagerly did I seize the basket, on finding it to contain a loaf of coarse bread and a small bottle of water. I threw myself with avidity upon these humble ailments. They had, to all appearance, been placed in the vault for several days. Bread was hard and the water tainted, yet never did I taste food to me so delicious. When the cravings of appetite were satisfied, I busied myself with conjectures upon this new circumstance. I debated whether the basket had been placed there with a view to my necessity. Hope answered my doubts in the affirmative. Yet who could guess me to be in need of such assistance? My existence was known. Why was I detained in this gloomy vault? If I was kept a prisoner, what meant the ceremony of committing me to the tomb? Or if I was doomed to perish with hunger, to whose pity was I indebted for provisions placed within my reach? A friend would not have kept my dreadful punishment a secret. Neither did it seem probable that an enemy would have taken pains to supply me with the means of existence. Upon the whole, I was inclined to think that the Domina's designs upon my life had been discovered by someone of my partisans in the convent, who had found means to substitute an opiate for poison, that she had furnished me with food to support me till she could effect my delivery, and that she was employed in giving intelligence to my relations of my danger and pointing out a way to release me from captivity. Why, then, was the quality of my provisions so coarse? How could my friend have entered the vault without the Domina's knowledge? And if she had entered, why was the door fastened so carefully? These reflections staggered me. Yet still, this idea was the most favorable to my hopes, and I dwelt upon it in preference. My meditations were interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps. They approached but slowly. Rays of light now darted through the crevices of the door, uncertain whether the persons who advanced came to relieve me or were conducted by some other motive to the vault, I failed not to attract their notice by loud cries for help. Still the sounds drew near. The light grew stronger. At length, with inexpressible pleasure, I heard the key turning in the lock. Persuaded that my deliverance was at hand, I flew towards the door with a shriek of joy. It opened, but all my hopes of escape died away. The prioress appeared, followed by the same 4 nuns who had been witness of my supposed death. They bore torches in their hands and gazed upon me in fearful silence. I started back in terror. The domina ascended into the vault, as did also her companions. She bent upon me a stern, resentful eye, but expressed no surprise at finding me still living. She took the seat which I had just quitted. The door was again closed, and the nuns ranged themselves behind their superior, while the glare of their torches, dimmed by the vapors and dampness of the vault, gilded with cold beams the surrounding monuments. For some moments, all preserved a dead and solemn silence. I stood at some distance from the prioress. At length, she beckoned me to advance. Trembling at the severity of her aspect, my strength scarce sufficed me to obey her. I drew near. My limbs were unable to support their burden. I sank upon my knees. I clasped my hands and lifted them up to her for mercy, but had no power to articulate a syllable. She gazed upon me with angry eyes. "Do I see a penitent or a criminal?" she said at length. "Are those hands raised in contrition for your crimes, or in fear of meeting their punishment? Do those tears acknowledge the justice of your doom, or only solicit mitigation of your sufferings? I fear 'tis the latter." She paused, but kept her eye still fixed upon mine. "Take courage," she continued. "I wish not for your death, but your repentance. The draught which I administered was no poison, but an opiate. My intention in deceiving you was to make you feel the agonies of a guilty conscience. Had death overtaken you suddenly while your crimes were still unrepented, you have suffered those agonies. I have brought you to be familiar with the sharpness of death, and I trust that your momentary anguish will prove to you an eternal benefit. It is not my design to destroy your mortal soul, or bid you seek the grave burdened with the weight of sins. No, daughter, far from it. I will purify you with wholesome chastisement, and furnish you with full leisure for contrition and remorse. Hear my sentence. The ill-judged zeal of your friends delayed its execution, but cannot now prevent it. All Madrid believes you to be no more. Your relations are thoroughly persuaded of your death, and the nuns, your partisans, have assisted at your funeral. Your existence can never be suspected. I have taken such precautions as must render it an impenetrable mystery, that abandon all thoughts of a world from which you are eternally separated, and employ the few hours which are allowed you in preparing for the next. This exordium led me to expect something terrible. I trembled and would have spoken to deprecate her wrath, but a motion of the domina commanded me to be silent. She proceeded. Though of late years unjustly neglected, and now opposed by many of our misguided sister, whom heaven convert, it is my intention to revive the laws of our order to their full force. That against incontinence is severe, but no more than so monstrous an offense demands. Submit to it, daughter, without resistance. You will find the benefit of patience and resignation in a better life than this. Listen then to the sentence of St. Clare. Beneath these vaults there exist prisons intended to receive such criminals as yourself. Artfully is their entrance concealed, and she who enters them must resign all hopes of liberty. Thither must you now be conveyed. Food shall be supplied to you, but not sufficient for the indulgence of appetite. You shall have enough to keep together body and soul, and its quantity shall be the simplest and coarsest. Weep, daughter, weep, and moisten your bread with your tears. God knows that you have ample cause for sorrow. Chained down in one of these secret dungeons, shut out from the world and light forever. No comfort but religion, no society but repentance. Thus must you groan away the remainder of your days. Such are St. Clare's orders. Submit to them without repining. Follow me. Thunderstruck at this barbarous decree, my little remaining strength abandoned me. I answered only by falling at her feet and bathing them with tears. The domina, unmoved by my affliction, rose from her seat with a stately air. She repeated her commands in an absolute tone, but my excessive faintness made me unable to obey her. Mariana and Alex raised me from the ground and carried me forwards in their arms. The prioress moved on, leaning upon Violante, and Camilla preceded her with a torch. Thus passed our sad procession along the passages in silence, only broken by my sighs and groans. We stopped before the principal shrine of St. Clare. The statue was removed from its pedestal, though how I knew not. The nuns afterwards raised an iron grate, till then concealed by the image, and let it fall on the other side with a loud crash. The awful sound, repeated by the vaults above and caverns below me, roused me from my despondent apathy in which I had been plunged. I looked before me. An abyss presented itself to my affrighted eyes, and a steep and narrow staircase whither my conductors were leading me. I shrieked and started back. I implored compassion, rent the air with my cries, and summoned both heaven and earth to my assistance. In vain. I was hurried down the staircase and forced into one of the cells which lined the cavern sides. My blood ran cold as I gazed upon this melancholy abode. Cold vapors hovering in the air, the walls green with damp, the bed of straw so forlorn and comfortless, a chain destined to bind me forever to my prison, and the reptiles of every description, which, as the torches advanced towards them, I descried hurrying to their retreats, struck my heart with terrors almost too exquisite for nature to bear. Driven by despair to madness, I burst suddenly from the nuns who held me. I threw myself upon my knees before the prioress and besought her mercy in the most passionate and frantic terms. "If not on me," said I, "look at least with pity on that innocent being whose life is attached to mine. Great is my crime, but let not my child suffer for it. My baby has committed no fault. Oh, spare me for the sake of my unborn offspring. O merit tastes life, your severity dooms to destruction." The prioress drew back haughtily. She forced her habit from my grasp as if my touch had been contagious. "What?" she exclaimed with an exasperated air. "What? Dare you plead for the produce of your shame? Shall a creature be permitted to live, conceived in guilt so monstrous? Abandoned woman, speak for him no more. Better that the wretch should perish than live, begotten in perjury, incontinence, and pollution. It cannot fail to prove a prodigy of vice. Hear me, thou guilty. Expect no mercy from me either, for yourself or brat. Rather pray that death may seize you before you produce it. Or if it must see the light, that its eyes may immediately be closed again forever. No aid shall be given you in your labor. Bring your offspring into the world yourself. Feed it yourself. Nurse it yourself. Bury it yourself. God grant the latter may happen soon, lest you receive comfort from the fruit of your iniquity." This inhuman speech, threats which it contained, the dreadful sufferings foretold to me by the Domina, and her prayers for my infant's death, on whom, though unborn, I already doted, were more than my exhausted frame could support. Uttering a deep groan, I fell senseless at the feet of my unrelenting enemy. I know not how long I remained in this situation. I imagine that some time must have elapsed before my recovery, since it sufficed the prioress and her nuns to quit the cavern. When my senses returned, I found myself in silence and solitude. I heard not even the retiring footsteps of my prosecutors. All was hush, and all was dreadful. I had been thrown upon the bed of straw. The heavy chain, which I had already eyed with terror, was wound around my waist and fastened me to the wall. A lamp, glimmering with dull, melancholy rays through my dungeon, permitted my distinguishing all its horrors. It was separated from the cavern by a low, irregular wall of stone. A large chasm was left open, in which formed the entrance. For door there was none. A leaden crucifix was in front of my straw couch. A tattered rug lay near me, as did also a chaplet of beads, and not far from me stood a pitcher of water and a wicker basket containing a small loaf and a bottle of oil to supply my lamp. With a despondent eye did I examine this scene of suffering. When I reflected that I was doomed to pass in it the remainder of my days, my heart was rent with bitter anguish. I had once been taught to look forward to a lot so different, and one time my prospects had appeared so bright, so flattering. Now all was lost to me. Friends, comfort, society, happiness. In one moment I was deprived of all. Dead to the world, dead to pleasure, I lived to nothing but the sense of misery. How fair did that world seem to me, from which I was forever excluded? How many loved objects did it contain whom I never should behold again? As I threw a look of terror around my prison, as I shrunk from the cutting wind which howled through my subterraneous dwelling, the change seemed so striking, so abrupt, that I doubted its reality. That the Duke de Medina's niece, that the destined bride of the Marquis de las Cisternas, once bred up in affluence, related to the noblest families in Spain, and rich in a magnitude of affectionate friends, that she should in one moment become a captive, separated from the world forever, laid down with chains and reduced to support life with the coarsest ailments, appeared a change so sudden and incredible that I believed myself the sport of some frightful vision. Its continuance convinced me of my mistake, with but too much certainty. Every morning my hopes were disappointed. At length I abandoned all idea of escaping. I resigned myself to my fate, and only expected liberty when she came, the companion of death. My mental anguish and the dreadful scenes in which I had been an actress advanced the period of my labor. In solitude and misery, abandoned by all, unassisted by art, uncomforted by friendship, with pangs which if witnessed would have touched the hardest heart, was I delivered of my wretched burden. It came alive into the world, but I knew not how to treat it, or by what means to preserve its existence. I could only bathe it with tears, warm it in my bosom, and offer up prayers for its safety. I was soon deprived of this mournful employment. The want of proper attendance, my ignorance how to nurse it, the bitter cold of the dungeon, and the unwholesome air which inflated its lungs, terminated my sweet babe's short and painful existence. It expired in a few hours after its birth, and I witnessed its death with agonies which beggar all description. But my grief was unavailing. My infant was no more, nor could all my sighs impart to its little tender frame the breath of a moment. I rent my winding sheet and wrapped in it my lovely child. I placed it on my bosom, its soft arm folded around my neck, and its pale cold cheek resting upon mine. Thus did its lifeless limbs repose, while I covered it with kisses, talked to it, wept, and moaned over it without remission, day or night. Camilla entered my prison regularly, once every 24 hours, to bring me food. In spite of her flinty nature, she could not behold the spectacle unmoved. She feared that grief so excessive would at length turn my brain, and in truth, I was not always in my proper senses. From a principle of compassion, she urged me to permit the corpse be buried. But To this I never would consent. I vowed not to part with it while I had life. Its presence was my only comfort, and no persuasion could induce me to give it up. It soon became a mass of putridity, and to every eye was a loathsome and disgusting object. To every eye but a mother's. In vain did human feelings bid me recoil from this emblem of mortality with repugnance. I withstood and vanquished that repugnance. I persisted in holding my infant to my bosom and lamenting it, loving it, adoring it. Hour after hour have I passed upon my sorry couch, contemplating what had once been my child. I endeavored to retrace its features through the livid corruption with which they were overspread. During my confinement, this sad occupation was my only delight, and at that time, worlds should not have bribed me to give it up. Even when released from my prison, I brought away my child in my arms. The representations of my two kind friends at length persuaded me to resign my unhappy infant to the grave. Yet I parted from it with reluctance. However, reason at length prevailed. I suffered it to be taken from me, and it now reposes in consecrated ground.